Good morning.
Good morning, Stell.
Morning.
Good morning, everyone. I think we're slowly letting everyone in, so we should get started shortly. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stella Payne, and I am an SPJ at large member. I want to welcome everyone, and I'm really excited to be introducing our speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Laura Usselman. She grew up in Atlanta and attended the University of Georgia. She earned her MFA in fiction and worked in academic publishing before becoming an agent at the Stuart Krichevsky Literary Agency. Laura represents a mix of literary fiction and narrative nonfiction, and she particularly enjoys working with journalists on their debut books. Some recent examples include Caitlin Tiffany's Everything I Need I Get From You, a New York Times noticeable book, and Catherine Blunt's California Burning, a national bestseller. Laura is the mother to 3 daughters and lives in Decatur. Laura, we welcome you.
Thank you guys so much. And I think just by way of housekeeping, we were going to try to keep everyone on mute, right, during the presentation. I'll share my screen for a bit. And then if you have questions as we go along, feel free to drop them in the chat and I will try to notice them when they appear. And then we'll have some time for dedicated questions at the end. Okay, now I'm going to attempt this exercise. Okay, can everybody see that? We're all good? Okay. So thank you, Stella, and thank you to the SPJ. I'm very happy to be talking to everybody. I wanted to sort of spend our time in 2 parts today. The first part of this presentation is, I know that we're supposed to be talking about writing a first proposal. I want to spend some time before we talk about that on refining your idea for what your book is. That's what I spend a tremendous amount of my time on with clients when they are proposing a new book. I think journalists in particular, I work with a lot of journalists. I really enjoy working with journalists. A great benefit of working with journalists is that you guys have a wonderful intuitive sense of good stories, always a lot of good ideas. And I really like the process of trying to figure out which of those ideas feels like it has the shape of a book, and putting together a really compelling pitch for that book. So the first half of the presentation, like I said, we're going to concentrate a little bit on this initial important question of, is it a book? And apologies in advance, I'm going to do this very obnoxious, pitchy thing where I use my clients as examples throughout. This is, of course, in part because I love them and I think that they're brilliant, but also because these are obviously the projects that I have worked on the most closely, and I've had to think through all of these questions in the context of these books. So I think two big questions sort of guide my thinking around the question of whether or not a story that someone has sunk their teeth into feels actually like a book project, or if it feels like a really compelling long form feature or a podcast or any of the other forms of media that we consume and compete for our attention with books, which is sort of the reality of the book writing world right now. The first one of those is, does the story have broader ramifications or themes that will endure? And this is pretty intuitive, but I think often, this is sort of the thing that guides a journalist a lot of times towards thinking, a long form investigation that I just spent 2 years on, I either satisfied myself and my readers by writing 8,000 to 10,000 really compelling words about it, or I think this belongs between book covers. And that's sort of the question of, does the story that you told or that you're considering telling, does it have sort of tendrils that reach out into a lot of other parts of culture or politics that you think deserve more space than a feature story might allow? And also, are those themes ones that we will still care about and might turn to the book to read about in a decade or 2 decades? Because that realistically is how publishers are trying to think about the books that they do. They do want them to have initial success, and that's always really helpful to a book. But any publisher's true financial bread and butter and their sort of pride as a publisher is their backlist and the books that sell and sell forever. So I think thinking at the outset about whether the story that you want to tell reaches outward in a satisfying way and in a way that will still be relevant in 20 years' time is an important first sort of smell test of the story that you want to approach. And the book cover that I shared right there is for California Burning. These are the 2 books that Stella mentioned in the introduction on this slide. California Burning is an investigative story by a Wall Street Journal reporter who wrote about the Northern California utility company that went bankrupt, which was, a very interesting, compelling business case. But the reason that it has broader implications is certainly, doesn't have to do with the tick, tick, tick of events that went on in the C-suite. It has to do with the fact that PG&E, the utility company, was trying to transition to a green energy infrastructure, and the problems that they faced and the problems that they faced because of wildfire risk are ones that we are going to continue to face, and we're going to continue to face all over the country. So that was part of how we pitched this as a book project, that basically these are issues that will endure and will expand. And then the other sort of thing that a book that might make something a book, I think is the question on the right side of the screen. Is there a piece of commentary or an argument that only emerges at length? And the example that I'm using here is Caitlin Tiffany's Everything I Need I Get From You, which Caitlin's argument making this book was basically, we have never taken fangirls very seriously because they seem inherently culturally silly to us. But if you actually look at the way that they behaved on the internet in the aughts, you can see the fact that they really shaped the way that all of us interact with one another on the internet, for better or worse. And that was sort of you can tell a series of anecdotes about fan behavior, and those are satisfying, but it takes the length of a book to put those things into conversation with one another in a way that this big cultural argument can emerge. So I think that those are kind of 2 different schools of nonfiction journalistic book writing. But I think you want to make sure that your idea for a book satisfies one of these sort of initial smell tests. I will also say, as we go through this whole first part of the presentation, all of these are kind of rules of thumb that can be broken. I will say it's really helpful to have a single narrative at the heart of a book, but I'm going to give a lot of examples of books that don't have that kind of single narrative. You can always violate any rule of book writing can be broken. I think you just want to think about the fact that the quality of your proposal and how commercial it seems to book editors at the very front end of the process is going to determine the quality of the publisher that purchases the book and the size of the advance that supports the writing of the book. And so you just need to go a little bit eyes wide open in if you decide that you want your book to be a really odd duck, that's totally a valid way to approach a book. And many books, we can think of many dramatically commercially successful books that break all of these rules, but you might be making things harder for yourself from the outset. So if there is a way to make things easier for yourself as a working writer, I think you should always take them. The next part of the sort of is this a book question is what is the narrative, which again just feels like a deeply intuitive question. But I think a lot of the times the things that we come to as book topics are things that really interest us in terms of all those tendrils that snake out into the broader culture and all of the ramifications of a more granular story. And, you know, the way that a particular character allows you to access a bunch of interlocking forces, but you still need a story at the heart of the book. Or an organizing principle of some kind. I often talk to clients about this as the spine of the book. It's basically the question of, okay, a book is asking someone to keep turning pages for 300 pages, and that is a lot of investment from the reader. And so what is it on an actual page-to-page level that is going to keep them moving through the book? I dropped these two pictures here, sort of reminders to myself of these two very different models, and I'll use these two as examples. Worn, Sophie Tannhauser's first book, that was one of the most complicated structures I have ever helped someone figure out, and is sort of an example that shows that you don't always need a single narrative. You just need something that feels like it coheres the whole book together. So Sophie wanted to write a really discursive, big book about the apparel industry and both its history and its present tense and the way that the apparel industry had become so globalized and so complex. And she was sort of answering the question, and this became really important to us, why, if you go to the store and you look at the clothing labels and you see where your clothing comes from, why does it come from those places? And that's both a historical inquiry and a contemporary reporting inquiry. And that didn't leave us with any kind of intuitive structure for the book, any intuitive narrative. And the structure that we came up with for that book was, okay, we're going to look at the 5 textiles that almost all of our clothing are made out of, and we'll tell the story of each of those textiles. And in the aggregate, that will show us basically the past, present, and future of clothing. That was really complex. It took us a long time at the proposal stage, and then it gave her an excellent roadmap for actually writing a book that was that complicated. So that's another thing to think about at the proposal stage. You're trying to come up with a structure that will actually be a helpful roadmap for you as you write a book. The headshot there on the right, that's because I don't have a book cover for this book yet. That's my client, Carla Ciccone, and she's writing a book called Nowhere Girls, which is based on a feature that she did for Harper's Bazaar about getting diagnosed with ADHD when she was 39. And Carla was really interested in looking at this big cultural cohort of women who have been diagnosed in adulthood with ADHD and the ramifications for getting a diagnosis so late in life. But again, that can become a really discursive, really open-ended inquiry to try to write about this big group of people and to write about the pharmaceutical industry and, you know, the science of the brain and the neurodivergent brain. So we really needed from the outset an organizing principle for that book. And in her case, she uses the story of her own life. Basically, she says at the outset of the book, I didn't know how to tell the story of my life to myself until I got my ADHD diagnosis. So here I am going to retell it to you. And every chapter allows her to expand outward and talk about something broader and more interesting to her, like, you know, when she writes about her own youth, she can talk about the way that we treat ADHD and autism in schools. So I think that's quite a common organizing principle, to use the single life of either the author or a different individual that you're reporting on to guide the structure of the book. This is all to say you just need that kind of spine organizing principle from the outset. It can take many shapes and forms, and it's a big part of what you're trying to figure out when you write a proposal. I put a couple notes at the bottom there. This is that, how to make your life easier notes. Chronology is your friend. I know, again, that sounds intuitive, but it's often tempting to want to jump around in time and to organize things in some sort of more thematic way. I think you have to have a really good reason to uncouple yourself from a linear chain of events, because there's something just very appealing about reading a story that goes from point A to point B. And single narratives make things a lot easier. Again, both of the books on this page violate that in some sense, but I think if you think about the massive, hits of narrative nonfiction of recent years, like David Grann or Patrick Radden Keefe, if you find a single narrative, a story of a single set of characters and events that allows you to access all of the big thematic things that interest you, that's a best case scenario. That's the most commercial incarnation of an idea. Another question to ask yourself at the outset, and this is one of the things that I read the most carefully for when I'm reading things in on submission, is who are the characters in the book and how independently appealing and charismatic are those characters? This is a question that I think comes up a lot in early editorial conversations about narrative nonfiction. Again, you want to access a big, important set of current events issues. You want to access a really juicy story, but you also really want people at the heart of that story that will interest the reader and bring them along through the book. The people on this screen are from a proposal that I just sold, so I truly have nothing to share, a cover or anything about it, but it's from a reporter who lives in South Florida, and he works at the Miami Sun-Sentinel, and he has grown really interested in the pythons, the Burmese pythons that are an invasive species in the Everglades, and he's interested in how this is a phenomenon that's going to increase, not decrease, as the climate changes, and how these snakes might make their way further and further north into the rest of the Bible Belt. So we are on the alert here in Georgia. So this is obviously a story with a lot of ramifications, a big environmental science story, but stories that make people think hard about climate change can be really difficult. And one reason why this story never felt difficult to me, and we had a lot of good editorial interest in it, is that the people that he writes about are all the people who are trying to hunt the snakes in the Everglades, and the scientists who are trying to come up with ways to get them out of the swamp. And it's just full of these like ridiculous, larger than life people from Florida, which is a delight to read about. And as soon as I knew that that's who he was spending time reporting with, and that's who was going to populate the actual pages of the book, I was really gung-ho about working with him and working on the proposal. So there are certainly cases in which you're making the case in the proposal that the characters themselves are going to be the thing that really like propels a reader through the book. And in this case, that was definitely the case. And sorry, guys, I know I'm kind of flying along. I want to make sure that we leave time for questions, but please do drop them in the chat if you have them as I go. And then these are some other things to think about. This is less a question of, is it a book, and more a question of, okay, but is it a book that I would like to now spend a number of years of my professional life on? The first of those is, are there competitive books directly on the same subject? The book on the left here is a book about, it's a prescriptive, self-help book about how to feed babies, how to bottle and breastfeed. And the reason that I took on this project and that I think it did well on submission is that we could make the argument that there is a big competitive market for this book, but it's a really dated one, and we really need new resources, and this book will do something dramatically different than those older books in the same field. And I think the same thing is true when you're approaching a subject as a journalist that may have been approached in the past. It's a big question in narrative history, for instance. You know, we may read stories that have been told before, but if you can argue in a proposal, well, there's new sourcing that was never available before about this book, or I've been able to access an archival trove of information that no previous writer has been able to access. So, you know, I'll be able to tell this story in a new light. That can help distinguish your book from the books that are already out there in the market. And then the book on the right here is a book that my client Zoe Schiffer wrote about the collision of Elon Musk and Twitter. And I use this as an example of a book that was written in a complete foot race with other writers. We knew there were other books that were under contract already about Elon and Twitter. And Zoe sort of decided to jump into the fray of a really competitive market. I will say you can definitely do that. And Zoe, as like a completely competitive intent reporter, really thrived in that particular book writing environment where she was, you know, sprinting to write the story. She was competing for sources. I think you just have to know that that's what you're getting yourself into if you want to wade into a competitive fray like that. And you need to know how to make the pitch that you are the most exciting author to write the book to the publishers that you're going to go on submission to. So in Zoe's case, Zoe had impeccable sourcing from inside Twitter. And as things were melting down and as everyone was getting laid off, her sources were not getting laid off. She was really strategic about choosing them. And she just had this like incredible view into the building at that time. And that's how we made the argument that, you know, she deserved the opportunity to get in there and write one of these books in a really competitive market. So you have to think about those things from the outset and go in eyes wide open about the fact that it means that you're going to be crashing a book out probably as fast as possible with a sort of speculative result. And then these are the other sort of final things that I would advise thinking about before you embark on a proposal. Is this story going to be more or at least as relevant in 2 to 3 years? So I mentioned earlier, you want a book to be, you know, enduring and be read in 20 years, but you also need to acknowledge that it's not even going to exist for 2 to 3 years from the time that you propose it. So think about the question of, you know, is this a really exciting moment to propose the book, but in a couple of years' time, people will be thinking about this much less. That's a good reason to maybe look for a different idea from the outset. And then the other thing on this slide is a sort of amorphous and sticky question, which is this a subject that people will buy a book about? And this is something I feel like I end up talking to journalists a lot about, because if you are used to writing for an online audience, you know, including if you write for a newspaper or a national magazine where a certain number of stories at that magazine are not paywalled every month and people can find their way to them when they, you know, have a particularly salacious subject or when they go sort of mildly viral on some part of the internet. The barrier for entry on that work is just so much lower than it is for a book. The number of logistical and financial barriers that you are asking someone to cross to actually buy a book are massive. And you have to think about the fact that hardcover books now are all cost more than $30, right? It's a considerable investment for someone to be interested in a subject right when it's published. So you want to make sure that you're envisioning an audience and a readership that will buy a book. That's an important first step. And then I always find it's very helpful to have readers who self-identify in some way with the subject of the book, or people who might buy them a book, you know, like there's a conventional sort of publishing category of Father's Day books. And those are, you know, books that people buy for their dad. And it's because they know their dad has an interest in naval battles or baseball, you know. So these are the kind of things that it is something that we can profess a personal interest in. There are a lot of really like challenging stories about socioeconomic issues or cultural issues that everyone will read an article about. You know, I mean, this is bleak, but I think of one of these categories as like bad things that happen to children. A lot of people will read a 1,500 word story about something awful happening to a kid. It sounds horrible to say, but you know, like unlikely salacious crimes that reach a child, those can really have big readerships on the internet. Those do not have readerships at book length. I mean, obviously true crime stories thrive in some contexts, but I think if you're writing about, you know, something, a part of the foster care system, you are asking people to spend a lot of time reading about something that they will probably find really difficult. And if you're writing about something like, I mean, this is something I've talked to a potential client about before, you know, the issues of our contemporary adoption system. That's a really important subject, and it's really hard to identify who is going to buy that book, because people who are really trying to navigate that system ethically might not want to read a book-length treatise on the issues of, you know, our contemporary adoption system. And people who just feel critical of that world are probably not going to self-identify with the subject enough to buy the book. So it is much easier if there is something in the book that people can directly affiliate themselves with and you know, demonstrate an interest in. That's, again, a slightly squishy concept, but I think another good thing to think about before you embark on a project that's going to take a couple years of your time. Okay. This is the actual proposal writing part of the presentation, and I will speed through it a little bit so we can make sure that we get to people's questions. What I always tell people when they sit down to write a proposal is that the proposal, it is a flexible document. Proposals come in many different shapes and sizes. And the most important thing to think about when you start to write a proposal is that the proposal is the document that answers these questions that we've been talking about the whole time, which are, why is this a book? And why am I the best person to write this book? And why will I be able to bring a readership to the book? And everything that you use to make this argument is flexible. So I'll talk about the sort of conventional parts of a proposal, but please know that proposals come in many, many different shapes and sizes. So if you find a template on the internet that says like, this is exactly how it goes, that's untrue. They're more flexible documents than that. I'm starting at the chapter summaries, even though it's not generally the first part of a proposal, because I think it's often the first part that it's helpful to write in a proposal. This is the thing that I usually send people off to write. If we've talked about an idea, we've done this whole process of saying, who's the readership for it? What's the narrative? Who are the characters? Are we satisfied that this is your book? Then a client will go off normally and try to write a chapter outline, because that is sort of the test case for, does this hang together as a book when I actually try to put words on paper? So if you have an idea that you're pleased with, I think I would start here. Start by trying to outline the book. And then as you try to flesh out the chapter summaries of the book, I would think about a few things. Chapter summaries, you don't want them to be boring, and things in summary are innately boring. So I would think about how to try to make them a little bit lively. And often the way to do that is to start with some kind of narrative or essayistic moment, and then move to the mechanics of what you're going to cover in that chapter. And I think you don't need to shy away from the mechanics that you're going to cover in the chapter being delivered in super straightforward fashion. Like sometimes it's helpful to include a note that says, you know, I will report this by visiting X locale and talking with, you know, these 3 people who are experts in this field. You can be really direct and mechanical about the subject of, you know, the scope of the chapter that you're going to expand into. But I think you also want to provide a little bit of writing that is appealing and welcoming and helps an editor not just sort of have their eyes glaze over in the summary part of the proposal. After you have written a chapter outline, I find that to be the moment at which it's most helpful to back into writing some kind of overview of the project. And I will say, book proposals are flexible. It is unusual to see a proposal that doesn't include both some kind of overview and some kind of notes on the full structure of the book, even if they're not broken down by chapter. So an overview, it's a very specific form to a book proposal, but it quite closely resembles a book's introduction or foreword or prologue. So I think if you feel at sea about how to write this kind of document, go crack open some of your narrative nonfiction on your bookshelf and look at the introduction to the book. These usually begin again with some kind of narrative or essayistic piece of writing that really puts you into the moment and, you know, plunges you right into the subject of the book. And then it can expand into saying, you know, this book will attempt to answer all of these big picture questions that I find really interesting, and here's why you will also. So again, both of those things are sort of contained within an overview. I always try to make sure that people write this part of the proposal as beautifully as possible. I think this needs to be a piece of prose that really sings, and especially if one of the strengths of the book that you are proposing would be the actual telling, the actual prose. I think this part needs to just be a beautiful piece of essayistic writing. So think about that. You know, part of what you're doing in the overview is showing people the scope of the book, talking about, you know, this book is going to tell the story of this, and by telling this story, I'm going to, you know, be able to speak about all of these big, interesting issues. But you need to do it in such a way that editors, when they read the overview, they feel confident that they just want to be in a book that you write. So that's an important thing to think about. If your overview, you know, ends up being really narrative and essayistic and lovely, but it doesn't super directly or immediately just tell people the stakes of the book and its import, then sometimes I think it can be helpful to do a separate one-page document that more closely resembles flap copy. So like, you know, the writing on the back of the book or on the internal flaps of a hardcover, and just says like, you know, this is a story about X, and here is why it is so juicy and so wonderful. And you just have a sort of one page, and in this case, I would call that an overview, and then allow yourself to have the more essayistic introduction that takes its time getting to the heart of the book and shows people that your prose is really strong. So those are the sort of two first big pieces of a proposal. And like I said, they're the pieces that I think are the least, there are the fewest proposals that don't include those. A sample is one of those things that you always see in like an online template for a proposal, but I think it is more optional. And what it depends a lot on is how good of a job does your overview or your introduction do of showing off your prose and your narrative style. If you think that your overview is occupying or it works in a really different narrative register than your sample would, than like the actual book would, then that's a good case for needing a sample. And I'll use an example of a book that I worked on earlier this year. Caitlin Tiffany, who wrote the Fangirls book, her second book is it's called The Housewives Underground, and it's a narrative history. It's much different from the first book, and it's also substantially different from the kind of work that she does at The Atlantic, which is where she is on staff. And so when we were thinking about Caitlin's second book, it's a book about a group of female conspiracy theorists who emerged in the wake of the JFK assassination, and were both, you know, kooky in a lot of ways and also really perceptive. And we needed there to be some kind of sample showing what it would actually be like to read about the lives of these women, because the overview was really concerned with orienting us in history and in, you know, the rise of conspiratorial thinking and in all of the book's big picture themes. So that's a case where we did need a sample. A case where we didn't need a sample is Nowhere Girls, the ADHD book. Carla had written this lovely, you know, piece of writing that combined memoir and cultural writing for Harper's Bazaar. So she didn't need to create another sample that worked in that mode. For the sake of the proposal, we appended the story. So that's another thing to think about as a journalist. Like, is the work that you've done on that beat already such a good example of the way that you would work in a book that you can use it as part of the proposal? The other thing that I would just note when you're thinking about a sample and putting all of these pieces together is that proposals can get very bulky and unwieldy very quickly. And there is a lot of merit to having like a 35-page proposal. The biggest reason for that is that editors who get it in on submission can hand it to other people that they work with and ask them to read it quickly and feel like that's not that big of an imposition, which becomes a big part of how books are acquired. They have to sort of gather consensus and share them with colleagues. So it is a merit to have a tight, pointed proposal, and sometimes a sample will take you beyond that length. So that's something to think about. A bio, that's pretty intuitive. I don't think I need to talk too much about that, except to say that this is a place where you can customize how you would normally talk about your biography to really highlight your long, deep interest in the subject that you're proposing in the book. And then the audience and publicity and marketing sections, these sometimes are all different sections in a proposal. Sometimes none of them are present in a proposal. What I would say that might differ from, again, the sort of templates that you look at on the internet is that this is not a paint by numbers, one size fits all part of this document. I think you should really customize what you say here based on your strategic strengths. So if you have really good connections in, you know, to other journalists or to people who might be really effective big mouths about your book, that's a place to highlight that. If all of the stories that you've written on this subject for your newspaper or wherever it is that you routinely publish, if they have all just performed like totally above and beyond your paper's normal expectations, that's a place to highlight this. You know, if you have really good podcasting experience. So you don't need to just march through and say, I have 572 friends on Instagram or followers on Instagram. You know, you just include the things that are the most compelling, and tactfully elide the rest of whatever you don't think is as compelling about your bio. And then comp titles. I think this is one of those things that feels really inside baseball to people, and it is kind of inside baseball. I'll just give a couple notes because I know we're right up against our time about comp titles. So when editors try to acquire a book, they will need to use comparable titles to create a profit and loss statement that, tries to model what they might be able to do with your book. So they need to use really successful, really, really recently published books when they make the pitch for your book in-house. So if you have some of those, books for a similar readership that show that your kind of book can really sing, then that's great to include here. You can also include titles that are older, but that show that this is kind of a perennially, like, really healthy, vibrant category. I have a client who's working on a proposal right now that is sort of a medical mystery proposal. And so, we're looking back in the last 15 years and showing how many books that kind of try to untangle that kind of medical mystery have been successful. So you can also make that kind of case in your comp title section. The other thing that I sometimes find helpful from writers is if there are comp titles that you feel really communicate something structural or tonal about your work that is hard to communicate in a way other than saying, it'll be kind of like this, then those can also be really good comps to use. The one big asterisk and caveat and thing to bear in mind is that every comp title in the proposal should be wildly commercially successful. So sometimes you want to comp something to something, a book that you just love and is beloved by, a particular niche audience. And sometimes you can't use those things because you want to be reassuring editors that they will just do so well with your book in the comp title section. Okay, that was a sprint. So now I will happily try to stop sharing my screen and open things up for questions.
Laura, you have quite a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
And I'll help you navigate. And she wrote, how do we know what books are currently under contract? Can we only find that out through the agent?
That is a great question. So you definitely can talk to an agent once you have one about competitive books and about the performance of prior books. But I would recommend to anyone who is thinking really seriously about a book, about a particular subject, or about querying, to get a temporary membership to Publishers Marketplace. That's publishersmarketplace.com. Almost all new book deals now are announced on Publishers Marketplace. I announce almost everything I sell on there. And so you can navigate around by category, look at everything that's been sold on a subject. You can search by keyword. It's also really good for looking for agents to query because you can see everything that people have been selling. And I think it's $25 a month. So it's something you wouldn't want to do it forever, but for a couple months while you're trying to figure out what the marketplace is like, I would subscribe to Publishers Marketplace.
Then you have one from Stell. I'm curious about the work of an agent. What the challenges are, what the day-to-day work is like. Sometimes authors may not really know what things look like for an agent's perspective.
Yes, that's a good question. So I sometimes try to explain to people that as an agent, you're kind of trying to help your clients think about every business consideration in their writing life. So that can include a lot of different stuff. That can include, obviously, our bread and butter is trying to help people sell their books to publishers. And every part of that is, a big time-consuming part of the job. So obviously, everything I've been talking about has to do with trying to help people refine an idea and put together a proposal. That's a very enjoyable big part of my job. And then I go on submission to publishers. So I also sort of maintain close relationships with editors at all of the different big publishing houses. And so I know what their interests are. When I was just selling the book about the Everglades, it was definitely one of those cases of trying to think like, who is everyone that I know from Florida in the book publishing industry? And so having those kinds of like good relationships with editors is part of the job. And then we go on submission, we negotiate the deal. So the financial terms and all that, we negotiate the contract. So the sort of more minute details of a deal. And then we stay really involved at every point after the deal. So, I generally read a lot of drafts of people's work after they're under contract, and I'm there for all the publicity and marketing conversations with the publisher. So you're trying to be your author's advocate sort of at every phase of the book publishing process. And then some authors, they also have all sorts of other, I sometimes help freelance clients pitch places where they don't have relationships. Help people find speaking agents if that's something that might be another good like source of income for them. So it's sort of everything that might make your life a little easier or that you need to navigate from a business perspective in your writing life, agents get into.
Veldena, she writes, how do you narrow down a topic to write about? If you have a lot of experience that you want to write about, how do you narrow down what will be most interesting to publishers? This is if all topics check off these items you covered.
That's a good question. I think one thing that I didn't talk much about, but I would definitely, try to hold your potential subject to this test very strenuously is, do you want to think about it for 3 years? Like, do you want to do all the research involved in writing a book? Do you want to write 80,000 words? And then, a year after you finish writing that 80,000 words and your book gets put into production, do you want to try to talk to everyone out there about that book relentlessly for a period of time when you're promoting it and, thereafter? So I think your own sort of obsessive interest in a subject is a really important metric. So if there's something, if you have a number of ideas that you think could be commercial ideas, choose the one that you're like, can't get out of your head and want to spend the most time with. There are other answers to that question, but I think that that's probably the most important one.
Del has another question. I had the idea that you also represented some fiction writers. Is there a completely different approach in working with fiction writers?
That's a good question. It depends on the type of fiction. If you write really commercial fiction, then sometimes conceiving of a book project is kind of similar to what we just talked about. Like you need to have, the right hooky concept. You need to have the right pitch. It's really idea driven. If you're writing a thriller or a romantasy book, or it's really important that you evaluate the market, you come up with exactly what your pitch is, you outline. So I think it can be kind of similar. The only fiction I do is literary fiction, which is, those books really succeed or fail on the strength of the telling, not necessarily on the concept. So most of the fiction writers that I work with, we are looking at a much fuller manuscript together by the time we're talking about the book. I'm not trying to help them. I'm not telling them you can't write about any particular, subject in a novel. That they'll go off and do what they want to do. And then we'll start looking at a manuscript together and I'll start editing at that phase. So it is fairly different for me.
Janelle, how much time do publishers normally grant writers to complete the book after the proposal is accepted?
That's a good question. That's something you put in the proposal. Many times you'll have a sort of mechanical section at the end of the proposal that says, I'm proposing a book of 80 to 90,000 words that I will deliver 18 months after signing a contract, that kind of thing. The sort of rule of thumb that I give people normally is that 12 months is pretty quick to write a book of nonfiction. We do propose a fair number of books of nonfiction at a 12-month cadence. And that is a delivery date for a first full draft to your editor. So it's not the moment at which it's fully edited and ready to be put between covers. I think if it's a first book and you need to do a lot of research or reporting, 18 months is just more realistic. And we put a lot of 18-month terms in contracts. 2 years is also kind of realistic, but it's normally longer than I would put in a proposal. I think you don't want to be suggesting to editors from the front end that it's really going to be a bear to research and write the book. But I think that that's not an unrealistic, if you are thinking about how long it's actually going to take you to write a debut book of nonfiction, I think 2 years is not a bad metric to use. And then you put a due date in the contract when you sign the contract, and that could be extended. But you usually want it to be a fairly realistic deadline, because it is also one of the ways that a publisher can cancel a book is if it's really late. They usually only do that if they wanted to cancel it anyway, but you might as well not give them a good piece of ammunition.
And Anne has another question. What is the best way to approach an agent? Which modality and what kind of message?
So I think the most important thing to keep in mind when you're approaching an agent is that most agents tell you online how they want you to approach them, and you should do it that way. So I think like trying to, more directly reach someone, DM them on Instagram. I get like LinkedIn messages. Don't do that. Just we have a website and it tells you, approach me this way. This is how much of your writing to include. And I read all of those and I read them promptly. I would keep in mind that like Stuart, my boss who owns the agency, he is not signing a lot of people out of his slush pile. And that's going to be true of most people who have been doing this work. He has owned the agency for 30 years now, right? And he had a career prior to opening the agency. So he is working with people that he's worked with for decades and are really successful. So I also don't think, you don't necessarily need to be querying a bunch of editor or of assistant level people at agencies, but find, some interesting mid-career agents who you think are probably still substantially trying to increase their client list, and then just follow their instructions and write a nice professional note. And I think you'll have good luck.
And Giselle, are you seeing any trends in digital publishing compared to traditional publishing, a format of digital books versus paperback books?
So, I mean, all of the publishers that I work with publish in both formats and also in audio. They publish across all of the sort of conventional formats. There are certainly publishers that publish only digitally, only an ebook. I think if you are writing, reported nonfiction, there's probably not that many places that publish exclusively in a digital format that will crudely pay you enough to make it worth your time as a freelancer or someone who would need to take book leave, or someone who needs to go under contract and then write a book, which is how people write nonfiction. I think digital publishers are more likely to thrive in, genre fiction and those kind of spaces where, for instance, there's always been, a huge romance readership that reads an ungodly number of books. I mean, true romance readers read a book a day. And those people might buy a ton of books direct on their Kindle in a way that can make those books really thrive in a digital only publishing platform. But I would say the reported nonfiction that I generally work on, it is really rare for less than 75% of those sales. Like normally at least 75% of those sales are going to come from physical books. Like most of those readers are readers of physical copies. And then there's a smaller group of ebook readers and a smaller group of audio readers.
And it looks like Anna, it's cut off some of the message. Anna, do you want to just ask your
Yeah.
question? You can just
Sure.
ask the question. Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm a journalist turned MFA student in creative nonfiction, and I'm writing essayistic pieces that probably are in that odd duck category, but I'm also looking at commercially successful essayists. Some of my favorite authors, Kiese Layman, Eula Biss, Gia Tolentino. So just wondering, I can see how a lot of what you shared would apply to thinking about an essay collection or a book written in a more essayistic form or style, but is there anything else you would add just specific to that
Yeah.
genre?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I really like that style of writing, and a lot of my clients are people who write really, you know, who I came to because I really like their essayistic work. The authors you mentioned are good examples in many ways, one of which is that the first books of all of those folks, except for Gia Tolentino, were published by smaller literary places, and they've moved to more commercial houses because they've had a lot of great success from their early books. So I think that's not a discouragement. It's just, I think, a thing to realistically keep in mind, that like a lot of the places that can launch those books in a really satisfying way are the Grey Wolf or Tin Houses, or the, wonderful, but modestly paying literary houses. And also they have an incredibly high bar. Those places are not easy to penetrate as a writer. So but they've also launched, I have a book that's a very essayistic memoir called The Striker and the Clock that was published this summer. And it was shortlisted for the Grey Wolf Nonfiction Prize. And that's the kind of, like, I don't think there's a better launch pad for, debut literary nonfiction than that prize. So, there definitely are some really rewarding paths to take. Gia Tolentino is very frequently invoked because she is so admired. She is one of those cases where her platform was so strong at the time that she published her debut book, that I think the sort of like pithy response to the Gia comp, which I'm sure a lot of editors also see, is that like, if you are also like one of the most popular writers in the New Yorker, then like you may also write essays for us, so I think, you just have to be aware that those are the headwinds in that kind of writing. And sometimes I would just, I think if you want to pitch a book of essays, you need to have a really strong organizing principle that shows that the essays together are much more than the sum of their parts. And that can be hard, but I think it's also crucial to show that like this will really shine as a book in a way that these pieces individually would not be able to shine if they were just published in, magazines and could be encountered there. I would also try to not publish too many of the ones that you actually want to include in a book length project, because I think sometimes that's like, if you've published more than 50% of a book already, that can also be an obstacle.
Laura, can you look at someone's narrative and determine if it's going to be a good book?
It's a good question. I mean, I think if you have a really good story and you are a good writer, I think at this point that would be enough for me to feel excited about the prospect of working with you on a proposal. I think that's like the point at which I sign a lot of clients and start to, put a lot of time into their project, is knowing that they've chosen a good narrative and that they themselves are an exciting writer. I mean, because I work with quite a lot of more literary writerly projects, I think a metric for me is often, will I always be excited to see this person's name in my inbox? Like, no matter what they're, because I want to work with people for many books, not just a first book. So you can have a really good idea for one book, but I'd like us to be working together in 25 years, and to know that when you're sending me, something new that you've gotten your teeth into, that it will really be interesting, because, you're a journalist who has, a really keen eye into a certain part of the culture, or are just a beautiful writer, and, I'll be willing to follow you anywhere. And I think a lot of agents are working in with those things in mind.
I think we're coming up on time. It's 12
Yes,
o'clock.
it's been a whole hour. Thank you
Any
guys.
additional questions? Any additional questions for Laura?
I also, I navigated away from it so I could see all of your faces again, but that is my email, is lu@skagency.com. I just put it in the chat. So if you do have other questions and you don't want to stretch our time today or share them in front of the group, I am happy to answer things after.
This has been some wonderful information, and I just want to thank you so much, and thank you for your email information, and I'm sure people will be reaching out to you. So thank you again.
Thank you guys so much. It was good to see everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you.